everybody? Steve with Tam Books coming at you with Charles Coulombe, author of the next book of his, Blessed Charles of Austria, which is, I think it's coming out in August, so it's on for pre-order. But Charles, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. And yes, my very next book was indeed written by me. You're right. It's very true.
Now, this man has shrines all over the planet. In the North America alone, he has 16 shrines, 14 in the United States. Yeah. Who is this guy that made you want to write a book about him, and why is he so popular with everybody?
That's a good question, and the answer is several-fold. Why did I write the book? Well, I was paid to by Tan Books, that's why. But, of course, I had a particular interest in doing so. And the interesting thing was that the request came at a time when I was very strongly contemplating moving to Austria for schooling. And to have that offer came when it did, I thought, okay, I'm going. You know, you don't have to kick me 3 times in the head with a baseball bat. It's all right. I'll go. I know when I'm being pushed by Providence. So there have been 2 so far, the most unusual and enjoyable years of my life, even despite lockdown. So now then the question comes, who was this man and why is he so popular? Well, let's divide that into 2 parts, because those are 2 questions. The first question is, who was he? The answer is Blessed Emperor Charles the First, Emperor of Austria, Charles the Fourth, King of Hungary, Charles the Third, King of Bohemia. He was the last Emperor King of Austria-Hungary. He was beatified by Pope John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, who, but incidentally, was named after him. He was beatified by him in 2005. Because, you see, the Pope's father was a very loyal member of the Austrian army. So he named his son Karl after the emperor. And many years later, Karl's widow, who outlived him by a very long time, she only died in 1989. He died in 1922. She died in 89. She came to the Vatican. She was very devout. In fact, her cause for beatification has been introduced. She's a servant of God herself. But she went to go see Pope John Paul II, and he said, "It is a tremendous honor to meet my father's empress."
Wow.
Yeah. So, who was it? Well, interesting chap. He was the great nephew of Franz Joseph, who was the Emperor of Austria from 1848 till his death in 1916. His father was the nephew of Franz Joseph, his grandfather being Franz Joseph's brother. Now, his uncle was Franz Ferdinand, who, after Franz Joseph's son died, became the heir to the throne. Through a series of strange events, Karl, who was not, when he was born, anywhere near being heir to the throne, because Franz Joseph's son Rudolf was alive. Franz Ferdinand was the older of the 2 brothers, but he had not yet married, but he was doubtless going to. So there'd be a whole bunch of kids there. And then, of course, there was Karl's father. So the likelihood was that Karl would never be king and emperor. But his cousin Rudolf was killed, or killed himself, or was murdered at Mayerling. It was really the JFK assassination of the 19th century. It's still a mystery. All sorts of strange tales about it, and I do deal with them in the book. So he was out of the way. And then Franz Ferdinand marries, all right, but he marries morganatically. That means he marries a non-royal, which means that his children can't inherit the throne. So he becomes the heir to Franz Ferdinand. His father dies before he does. And so by the time Franz Ferdinand is murdered and World War I breaks out, he was the heir to the throne. Now, He was an interesting character because for a lot of reasons, frankly. His parents were very badly suited to each other. Uh, his father was a ne'er-do-well, a roue, tons of affairs, a gambler, lighthearted, very fun. People loved him. I mean, the sorts of scandals that other people couldn't get away with. The Viennese papers just lauded him. Our Otto, Schönste Otto, the handsome Archduke, this kind of thing. He could do no wrong as far as the Vienna papers were concerned. But he was not what you would call a deep thinker, and not the most moral of men, to say the least. So he was paired off with a Saxon princess, the Archduchess Maria Josefa. She was very, very devout, but kind of dour. Not the most exciting person. So when he got married, Otto thought he was in love. But after she gave birth to Karl, that kind of dulled, and he began to fall back into his old ways. Then she gave birth to another son, and he straightened up and flew right for a while. Mm-hmm. But in the end, unfortunately, he died of syphilis. Now, this is a terrible story. And for a lot of people, it would be why they were such terrible people. Not Karl. He, interestingly enough, and this is why I say toward the end of my book, that while he was a brilliant soldier, a great ruler, a tremendous husband, a tremendous father, he had one other quality that I don't think anyone else has touched upon. Perfect patron for broken homes and difficult families. Mm-hmm. Because he loved both of his parents, and he got the best out of them. From his dad, he got his easy manner, his sense of humor, his unsinkable personality, his effervescence, but not the immorality and not the shallowness. From his mother, he got the deep piety and the devotion to duty and all that, but not the dourness and the, So he managed to get on very well with both his parents, as I say, and took from each of them the very best. He was very devout from the beginning, but he was also full of fun from the beginning. And so it's as though he reflected the best of each of them. I'd hate to think of somebody who was, as immoral and shallow as the father and as dour as the mother. I mean, that would be a real killer combination. I mean, we'd probably elect him to something over here, but still, it would not be nice.
As they say, joyful saints. So he was a joyful saint to begin with.
Yeah, he was. He really was, and very devout, very much into the Blessed Sacrament, and the Sacred Heart, and the Rosary, but also very much very human. He took to soldiering like a duck to water, and he was very good at it. He was one of the very, very few rulers in World War I that had actually been at the front.
Oh, wow.
There were only a couple of others, but that was why they called him the Peace Emperor, because as soon as he became emperor, he wanted the war to end. He wanted out because he knew what was happening. He knew the horrors the men were facing up front and personal. It's interesting that, to my knowledge, the only other heads of state who did something similar were, oddly enough, Austria's great enemy, the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, and the King of the Belgians, King Albert. There was one other person, the anniversary of whose death was yesterday. He wasn't a ruler at the time, but he ended up becoming one. And that was the Prince of Wales, who became Edward VIII. He was so close to the front that he literally saw his chauffeur killed in front of him.
Oh, wow.
And that's why, when people say, oh, Edward VIII was pro-German. No, he wasn't pro-German, but he was definitely not pro-war. Because, unlike so many of the people who were talking about it, he'd, seen it, you know. My
different
father
perspective when you're there.
Well, yeah. I mean, my father was a tail gunner in World War II. He used to say that there are no pacifists like soldiers who've actually seen the elephant.
Yeah. They used to ask my dad all the time. They found out he was a Nam and asked him about it, and he'd quickly give the worst story in the planet to get them to stop talking about it.
Yeah, yeah, because that must be great. No,
Yeah.
you do the best you can, and that's it. But at any rate, with Carl, he was a remarkable young man, and he met an equally remarkable young lady, and she was a princess of Bourbon-Parma, which was one of the little Italian states that were overrun in 1860 by the Sardinians. Mm-hmm. So she grew up all her life in exile. But she, too, very strong-willed character like her husband, very devout like her husband. And after they got engaged at the great shrine of Mariazell, they made the pilgrimage there. And Charles said to her, now we must help each other get to heaven. And his marriage was a huge thing to him, mm-hmm. as was fatherhood. In all, they'd have 8 children together in rapid succession, including one born after he died.
Wow.
Which shows you they didn't stop.
He was exiled. How many did he have out in exile?
7.
7 in exile?
Yeah. And we'll get there. So he had a problem, and the problem was, as heir to the throne now, or as heir to the heir, mm-hmm. Franz Ferdinand was his uncle. And they were actually very close. And this, too, is another interesting thing about Kaiser Karl. Franz Ferdinand and Franz Joseph did not get on very well. Franz Ferdinand, of course, had married morganatically, which his uncle was dead set against. But it was a very happy marriage, you see, unlike Franz Joseph's own marriage. Mm-hmm. And secondly, Franz Joseph wanted to maintain the status quo. Franz Ferdinand believed that Austria had to become federated with all of its different peoples basically inhabiting their own country, with the emperor over them all, keeping them in tandem. Well, Franz Joseph didn't like that, and neither did the Hungarian liberals. Austria-Hungary was just that. It was a dual monarchy at that time. Mm-hmm. So you might be emperor of Austria, but you're also king of Hungary, and you had differing roles. All of that would face Karl when he became emperor. He was very fond of both his great uncle and his uncle, and I cannot help but think, because a lot of writers have mentioned the fact that despite their antipathy to each other, they both got on very well with Karl, who did not set up like a third center of intrigue or something. And in thinking about it, you know why he got on so well with his uncle and his great uncle both? It's the same reason he got on so well with his parents. He loved them.
Simple.
Sometimes the solutions to these questions are not really that difficult.
Yeah, just simple.
He loved them.
Yeah.
So, Franz Ferdinand, as you know, was murdered. That was the beginning of World War I. Karl went off to the front, and actually to several fronts, because he would constantly report back to his great uncle about the progress of the war. Mm-hmm. So he was in Galicia. He was in Transylvania. He was on the Serbian front. He was on the Italian front when that opened up. And in fact, interesting story, they have flash floods in that part of the Alps. Mm-hmm. And it so happened that there was a soldier who had been wounded, and so was being used basically to mind the horses in a sort of ad hoc stable they had. This wall of water comes down, and he's not quite a cripple, but, is not in good shape. The water knocks him into the stream. Well, Archduke Karl jumped into the stream and rescued him. I mean, that's just an amazing story. So, his great uncle dies. He becomes the emperor in 1916, and he has 2 definite goals: peace and federation. The problem was he couldn't do his peacetime goal without solving the war, and he couldn't solve the war without accomplishing his peacetime goal. And what made things even more difficult was that in the end, both our own Woodrow Wilson and the French Clemenceau were absolutely, for ideological reasons, resolved to destroy Austria-Hungary. So,
is it true that Benedict XV wrote that was it the peace, the beg for peace, and Blessed Karl was the only one that basically was following it?
Pretty much, he was the only one who gave a really positive response. Kaiser Wilhelm sort of hemmed and hawed and thought it was a good idea. Mm-hmm. Our president said, "Stay out of politics, churchman. Mm-hmm. Only essential services," he said. "Everything else has to be shut down." Oh, sorry, different politician to a different. Never mind. I didn't mean any of that. So, I don't want to get present horrors mixed up with the old ones. So, in the end, the Austrians and the Hungarians and so forth were faced with a kind of an ultimatum. They had to get rid of the emperor or starve, because Woodrow Wilson made it very clear that they would not lift the embargo otherwise. And they were starving, quite literally. So, I go into great detail about this, but the long and the short of it was that Karl had to go into exile in Switzerland. And when he did, he nevertheless still felt responsible for his countries. He never abdicated, you say. Mm-hmm. And then, in the meantime, the government that took over in Hungary was run by a communist named Bela Kun, who soon put in a communist dictatorship. They had a secret police. They were doing all the fun stuff the communists do. And then they were overthrown by a combination of Romanians and Hungarian right-wingers, headed by a guy called Admiral Horthy, who claimed to be the regent to the king. But when the king started making noises about coming back, suddenly Horthy wasn't all that keen. So he made two attempts to return to his Hungarian throne. Both times the French foreign minister said, "If you succeed, we'll back you up. If you don't, we won't."
Thanks.
So he did not succeed either time. And at this point, the Allies were tired of him making trouble, as they thought, for Switzerland. So they shipped him off to the island of Madeira in the North Atlantic. Now, the problem was that they also cut him off from all his money and refused to allow any of his supporters to send him money. So he and his wife got to Madeira with no money and no place to live. Fortunately, a man lent them his house, but it was a summer house way up in the mountains, and he had wrecked lungs. So he got pneumonia and he died. A very long, lingering, unpleasant death because of the sovereign remedies applied to cure him, cupping and things like that.
What year was that?
So cupping, it's when they heat up.
No, what year was that?
Oh, 1922. Yeah. So, interestingly enough, the day he died, he said some very interesting things. One of them was, "I'm suffering that my peoples might come back together." Mm-hmm. He said that several times. But then at one point, he says to his wife, "As soon as I'm buried, you must contact the King of Spain, and he'll take care of you. I've spoken to him, and it'll be all right." She said, "You couldn't have spoken to him. There's no way to get through." He says, "No, just do as I say." So sure enough, after he was buried, she was able to get through, and the king sent a warship to pick them up. And the British complained and said, no, we're not going to let her go until they abdicate all their rights to the throne forever and ever and ever. And King Alfonso XIII said, "You can fire on my ship, in which case it'll fire back. It will be a war. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it'll just go in and pick them up," which is what happened. So they were in Spain for a few years, and then in Belgium. But and then it had a hair-raising escape from the Germans after the fall of France. Wild, wild story. Absolutely wild. But Karl, interestingly enough, already after he died, he had a prelate that had been praying for him that now started praying to him and pushing his beatification. And that organization, the now called the Emperor Karl League for Prayers,
Mm-hmm.
are the big ones, shall we say, in promoting his cause. But the way they came to being was strange, because when he was 5 years old, his father and mother, his father being in the army, was sent to Oldenburg, which is now called Sopron. It's in Hungary, but on the Austrian border.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a nun there, and the nun was the superior of the Ursuline school, but she had a sideline. She was a stigmatic and kind of a mystic.
Hmm.
So this priest friend of the Archduke and his wife and his little Karl had told her all about the Archducal family and so on. And she said, Mother Vincentia said, that man is going to be emperor one day. But he will be such a great favor to Austria that the devil will do everything he can to ruin him. You must get people to pray for him. Well, they did. And their numbers grew. And they're the people, the Gebetsliga, who really pushed through with the beatification.
Mm-hmm.
They were a fascinating bunch, the Gebetsliga. So he got his first miracle in 2004. He was beatified. I was there. I saw it. He has his second miracle, who was a non-Catholic lady in Florida. So
I think I've heard of that.
To go you. Pardon me?
I think I heard this.
Yeah. So long and the short of it is that old Karl, he's on the rise. Now the question is, why is he so popular? That has to be subdivided. He's popular in Central Europe for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. He's popular in Peru and Mexico because they have certain connections to the Habsburgs. Why he is popular in the United States, though, that's the fascinating question. I deal with it in my book, but I hazard a guess. And the guess is, we cannot fathom a leader who is willing to die for us. It just doesn't make any sense. We're used to being bought and sold by our leaders. Mm-hmm. A leader who feels that it's his obligation, if necessary, to give up his life for us. That is a compelling picture.
Yeah, I can think of him picture. Or Garcia Moreno down in Ecuador.
Yeah. And of course, there's also, my little joke is that the United States are the world's longest running and most successful Oedipus complex. But we have basically been without a father since the revolution. And the man himself, rather than some viceroy, is always an exciting thing. So I think that's why it is, frankly.
And not to go off topic, but right when you said that, I could think of Queen Isabella talking about after when Columbus came back, making this proclamation of those are my children in the new land that we must help not only educate but take care of and health wise, just down the list of what a king and queen should be doing.
Well, I'll tell you, I remember years and years ago when the King of Rwanda came out to LA. I may have told you this story, I don't remember. But a security firm donated its services. So you have the king, the chancellor, his chancellor, myself as ADC. And you had maybe 15 or 20 of these pretty hard-bitten security guys. Mm. A lot of them were ex-cops, ex-vets. These were not easily impressed people. But after the end of 6 days, or however long the stay was, he took his leave of them. And I'll never forget this to the end of my days. He sat there in the chair, and starting with the commander of the detachment, one by one they came up. They knelt in front of him. He blessed them with the sign of the cross. And I'll tell you, we were all teary. And then after they left, he turned to me and he said, that is the problem with Americans. You are orphans. And in a lot of ways, Kaiser Karl, I think, answers that unspoken, unacknowledged, unwanted desire for that kind of leadership. That's my guess, anyway.
That's a good guess.
Well, I mean, you look at what we've got for leadership instead.
Yeah. Every 4 to 8 years.
Yeah.
Or if you're in the States, what do you get in your states?
The governors.
So, what do you hope somebody takes away from the book, besides historical context of Blessed Carl?
Well, several things. The first thing I think you would take away from the book is the way that God does intervene in life, in affairs. I neglected to mention that once they got to Spain, Queen Empress Zita, was chatting with King Alfonso of Spain and said, why did you push through for us like this? He said, it's the strangest thing, but the day they sent word that your husband was dying, I suddenly had the strangest feeling that if I didn't take care of you, my own wife and children would end up in the same position one day. And so then she told him about what her husband had said about speaking to the King of Spain. They just sort of, shrugged their shoulders and stared. But, so that's one of the things. I think another thing that you'll be able to take away from the book is the fact that sanctity is available to anyone in any state in life if they want it. But you have to want it, so you've got to pursue it. I think also that you'll see the importance of Mass and devotions. Huge part of his life. And I also feel that you'll see an idea of the way leaders should be. And also the virtue of staying true to the course you know to be right, even while everything is falling apart around you. That's very important. It's a lesson that we simply can't get too much of. Every time I get a note, society would feel differently. Who cares about society? Society is like a topless film festival. Who cares what society thinks about anything? What's important is what God thinks. What's important is what your conscience thinks. What's important is what's right. The rest of it, I don't know. It's so awful. What if people don't approve? Oh!
I remember Fulton Sheen, I think, said that once too. Who are they?
No. Who are they indeed? A bunch of frightened little munchkins who are, they're all brave when they're a mob. But if an individual gets pulled away from the pack and has to account for himself, then things get very different. Oh, yes. I remember, apropos of nothing, the riots in L.A. in 92. Mm-hmm. Well, nobody gets more belligerent than a liberal who's fearful. And the city of Beverly Hills is a fairly liberal place, but they gave orders to the police to shoot to kill anybody who crossed the Beverly Hills town limit. So this mob of rioters comes up, and 3 or 4 or 5 of them stupidly cross the painted line, and pop, 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 boom, boom, boom. Mm-hmm. And then the rioters went elsewhere because they stopped being a mob at that moment. I don't think that's a happy ending, but I do think it's something to bear in mind. People in mobs are very unpleasant.
Yeah, think about it wasn't mob related, but Moreno, after an earthquake somewhere in Ecuador, somebody was trying to boost up, as you say, the prices of their some of the necessities.
Yeah.
So he has them arrested, publicly flogs them in the middle of town, and somehow nobody did that ever again.
No, life is funny that way. I don't know why people are so afraid. They should have stood up to it.
So yeah, nobody said,
I'm going to charge whatever I want. Yeah. Anyway, you got any other questions for me?
That's about it. Appreciate it. And that's Charles Coulombe's book, Blessed Charles of Austria, available at tambooks.com in August, but you can pre-order it now on the website. The link will be below in the show notes. And yeah, anything else? Any last words, Charles?
Yeah. It was a great honor and a great pleasure to do it, to give a voice to a man that we haven't heard enough from.
Amen to that. I have a bunch of his prayer cards, and every time I go to a event, there's always 5 to 10 people that'll point, who is that guy? And they're intrigued with the story. Somebody will always say, I'm actually from that area, and I don't know who he is. Yeah.
Terrible.
Anyway, Charles, thank you for your time. He's Charles Coulombe. Buy all his books.
Yes, each and every one. May your tribe increase. And none of my books have caused anyone the coronavirus.
See, that's a stance you can. That's a stance you can pay right there.
That's right. So remember, operators are standing by. Void where prohibited. No CODs or postal money orders accepted. Not an actor. Help me out. What are the other ones?
Well, you got rum, the papacy.
No, not the other books. The other lines. Free while supplies last.
Oh, if you act now.
Oh, if you act now. That's right. That's right.
Wait, there's more.
Operators are standing by. So do it.
Charles, thank you.
You bet. God bless.
Bye-bye.